Andrew Myers, a reserved elderly gentleman with a calm and humble demeanor, walked into a bustling car dealership on a crisp afternoon. His trusty old sedan, though dependable, had seen nearly a decade of service, and he finally decided it was time for an upgrade. Dressed in a worn-out coat and well-worn shoes, Andrew appeared completely out of place among the sleek, modern interiors and the stylishly dressed clientele. But he wasn't there to impress anyone, not at all. His sole intention was to find a car that would meet his needs. As he strolled through the dealership, admiring the shiny vehicles on display, the staff's reaction was far from warm. Despite his clear interest, no one made an effort to offer assistance. Instead, the salespeople busied themselves with younger, flashier customers who seemed more likely to afford the dealership's luxury models. Andrew's modest appearance, almost like an invisibility cloak, seemed to render him completely invisible in the eyes of the staff. Garrett Blake, one of the salesmen, a young man with slicked-back hair and a confident, self-assured smirk, briefly made eye contact with Andrew. But just as quickly, his attention shifted to a well-dressed couple who had walked in moments after. The whispers among the staff, the dismissive glances, and the clear indifference were hard to miss. Andrew continued to wait patiently by a gleaming black sedan that had caught his attention, running his hand along its polished surface, imagining himself behind the wheel. After what felt like an eternity, nearly 20 minutes of being ignored, Andrew decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. He walked up to the main desk where 3 salesmen were chatting animatedly. "Excuse me," he said politely, his voice steady despite the frustration bubbling inside him. "I'm interested in purchasing one of your vehicles. Could someone assist me?" Garrett barely glanced up from his phone and replied dismissively, "We're a bit busy right now. Why don't you come back later?" Andrew's expression remained composed, but inside, a storm was starting to form. He nodded curtly, turning to leave with his heart heavy, filled with disappointment and rising anger. As he walked out, he overheard one of the salesmen mutter under his breath, followed by a light chuckle. Wasting time on window shoppers, the sneer in his voice was unmistakable. What they didn't realize, however, was that Andrew Myers was far from just an ordinary man. Over the decades, he had built a fortune through shrewd investments and an unmatched business acumen. Yet, he had chosen to live a simple life, valuing character over material possessions. That day's humiliation would not be easily forgotten, not by a long shot. As he drove away in his old car, a plan began to form in his mind. That evening, Andrew made several phone calls to influential contacts within the business world. By the following morning, he had arranged a strategic move that would not only change his life, but would also leave the dealership reeling. The next morning, Andrew Myers returned to the dealership, but this time he wasn't there as a customer. Thanks to a series of well-placed negotiations and a few timely phone calls the night before, Andrew had secured the necessary funds and agreements to acquiring the entire car dealership. As he stepped through the glass doors, the same staff who had ignored him the previous day were present, completely oblivious to the monumental change that had unfolded overnight. Andrew was dressed exactly the same, his humble coat and worn shoes in stark contrast to the shift that had just occurred. Yet, he walked in with the same quiet confidence, although this time, there was a determined spark in his eyes. Thomas Green, the dealership's general manager, a middle-aged man, noticed Andrew immediately. Unaware of who he was or why he had returned, Thomas plastered a forced smile on his face and approached him. "Good morning, sir," he said, his tone polite but insincere. "How can we assist you today?" Without a word, Andrew reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a neatly folded set of documents, and handed them to Thomas, watching his reaction carefully. Thomas furrowed his brow as he unfolded the papers, his face slowly draining of color. The confident smile that had been on his face just moments ago faded, replaced by an expression of disbelief and panic. What is this?" Thomas stammered, his voice quivering. Andrew broke the silence at last, speaking calmly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not here to buy a car," he said, his voice clear and resolute. "I'm here as your new boss." The room went completely silent, the weight of Andrew's words settling heavily on everyone. The once dismissive staff began to notice what was happening. Their curiosity piqued. Whispers spread among them as they tried to make sense of the unexpected turn of events. Thomas, still holding the papers with trembling hands, looked up at Andrew, his eyes wide with disbelief. This can't be right," Thomas muttered. "You bought the dealership?" "That's correct," Andrew replied, his voice firm yet composed. "As of this morning, I own this operation, and I'm here to make some changes." The staff exchanged nervous glances. Those who had mocked Andrew the day before now looked visibly uncomfortable. Garrett Blake, the slick-haired salesman who had dismissed Andrew with such arrogance, shifted uneasily, his trademark smirk replaced by a look of dread. Andrew turned to face the entire room, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority that demanded their full attention. "Yesterday, I came here as a customer," he began, looking to buy a car. "But instead of being treated with respect, I was ignored, dismissed, and judged solely based on my appearance. You assumed I wasn't worth your time. You made a mistake." The tension in the room was thick, and no one dared to interrupt. As Andrew continued, his words hit like a thunderclap. "As of today, things are going to change," he declared. "This dealership will no longer tolerate arrogance or discrimination of any kind. Every customer who walks through those doors will be treated with respect, regardless of how they look or what you think they can afford." Andrew turned back to Thomas, his eyes cold but resolute. "And that starts with leadership. Thomas, you're fired." Thomas's jaw dropped in shock. "Fired?" he echoed incredulously. "You can't be serious." "I'm very serious," Andrew replied without hesitation. "Your leadership has fostered a toxic culture here, and that ends now." The silence that followed was deafening. One by one, Andrew began addressing the other staff members, calling out those who had displayed the same dismissive behavior he had been subjected to. Garrett was one of the first names on the list. "Garrett Blake," Andrew said, his gaze locking onto the young salesman. Garrett froze, unable to meet Andrew's eyes. "You showed me exactly the kind of attitude this dealership will no longer tolerate. Pack your things." Garrett opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He knew there was no use arguing. With his head down, he turned and walked toward the back office to gather his belongings. As Garrett shuffled away, Andrew continued his assessment of the rest of the staff. Those who had sneered or whispered about him the day before were either dismissed or sternly warned that their behavior needed to change immediately. Andrew wasn't simply firing people out of a sense of revenge. He was determined to reshape the dealership's culture entirely. This was a message to everyone in the room. Respect and dignity would be the foundation moving forward. Those who had dismissed him, belittled him, or ignored him were about to learn the true cost of their actions. Andrew's mission was clear. A new era had begun, and it would be one defined by integrity, respect, and fairness. Principles he believed in deeply. Building a team that reflected the values he cherished: respect, humility, and kindness. Andrew set his sights on creating an environment where people mattered more than the bottom line. Among the group, one employee stood out: a young woman named Laura Bennett. Unlike her colleagues, Laura had discreetly greeted Andrew the day before and even offered him a warm smile. Though she wasn't in sales, Andrew remembered her small act of kindness, and it stuck with him. He saw potential in her. "Laura Bennett," Andrew called out. She stepped forward nervously, unsure of what was to come. "You're one of the few people here who treated me with even a shred of decency," Andrew continued. "Starting today, you'll be the new floor manager. I trust you'll lead with fairness and respect." Laura's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? But I've only been here 6 months," she stammered. "I'm not interested in seniority," Andrew replied, his tone firm. "I'm interested in people who treat others the right way." "Congratulations, Laura." The remaining staff, now visibly shaken, began to realize that Andrew wasn't there to simply punish. He was there to rebuild. He addressed the room once more, his voice calm but resolute. "This dealership will no longer operate as it has in the past," Andrew declared. I want each of you to understand that every customer matters. Whether they're dressed in a three-piece suit or an old coat like mine, they deserve your full attention and respect. If you can't uphold those values, there's no place for you here." By the end of the day, nearly half of the staff had been dismissed. Those who remained were given clear instructions on how the dealership would operate moving forward. Andrew wasted no time hiring replacements, prioritizing individuals who shared his vision for a respectful and inclusive workplace. The transformation of the dealership was swift. Word spread quickly about the dramatic events and the new ownership. Customers began to notice the difference almost immediately. Where arrogance and indifference had once prevailed, a welcoming and professional atmosphere now thrived. Within weeks, sales soared, and the dealership's reputation skyrocketed. People from all over the city came, not just to buy cars, but to experience the exceptional service that had become the dealership's hallmark. Andrew, however, remained as modest as ever. He didn't bask in the attention or take credit for the turnaround. For him, it wasn't about proving a point to the staff who had dismissed him. It was about creating something meaningful, a place where people felt valued. One afternoon, as Andrew walked through the showroom now bustling with activity, Laura approached him. "Mr. Myers," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you for believing in me and giving me this opportunity." Andrew smiled warmly at her. "You earned it, Laura. All I did was recognize what was already there. Just remember to keep treating people the way you always have, with respect. That's what truly matters." Laura nodded, her confidence growing with each passing day. Under her leadership, and with Andrew's guidance, the dealership continued to flourish. As Andrew prepared to leave the showroom, he took one last look around. The same space that had once been filled with indifference and condescension was now alive with positivity and purpose. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from the power he now wielded, but from the change he had brought about. This experience had served as a reminder that true wealth wasn't about money or possessions. It was about how you treated others and the impact you made on the world. Andrew Myers had proven that humility and kindness could triumph over arrogance. In doing so, he left an indelible mark, not just on the dealership but on everyone who crossed its doors.